Do you know your subject from your predicate? The difference between active and passive voice? Where exactly is the direct object and the indirect object? Believe it or not, grammar is at the heart of every document. When a historian begins their primary source analysis, there are many different layers or resolutions that they can approach the text at. They can look at it from a quantitative sense or a qualitative sense. They can look at it for particular types of information or for a general sense of the message being conveyed. And in fact, one of the most common methodologies is something known as close reading. Now, close reading has technical definitions depending on which discipline or field you are working within. But for here, I'm going to use the most general definition I can think of. A close reading is reading the document closely. Now, before anyone objects too much to that, let me explain a bit more what I mean. A close reading is when you go through a document carefully, thoughtfully, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, argument by argument, looking at the entire document for both its text and its context. I'm not speaking about looking at only the text in isolation. What do the words mean and nothing else? We are looking specifically at how the message is being constructed and what that message means within a wider environment of data. So there are different ways you can approach a close reading. You can read it in a naturalistic or humanistic way, where you read it in the same general manner that an audience member from the contemporary period would engage with that text. Try to absorb the meaning and the intentions of its creator. And that's a really good place to start. But what I want to provide for you today is a methodology for looking at the text in a slightly more systematic and fine-grained way. What do I mean by that? Well, instead of looking at the document as a whole, instead of looking at it for its overall narrative or argumentative structure, or even individual paragraphs or points, I'm going to take you through a document line by line, sentence by sentence, and specifically clause by clause. Now, why would we do this? Well, it provides us a different way of looking at the document. We as human beings can often read through a document and get the general message, the general sentiment, the general argument, and that's great. That's usually what the author is intending us to receive. But it can be helpful to look at things in a more isolatable and systematic way because it helps us get that little bit of extra insight. That insight might be rhetorical tricks or rhetorical effects that the author was using to help convey or be persuasive in their message. It can also help us isolate particular biases in the thinking of the author or particular environments or cultural assumptions in the way they're constructing their text. Things that are small, little, but add up over the large scale. So if you come away from a document with a certain feeling, a certain intuition, it can be helpful to go through it step by step to see the ingredients of what perhaps made you have that impression. And this is really good if you are doing this as part of an essay or an assignment, because instead of saying that the document says this and it's my general feeling, you can point to very specific evidence about how that emotion or that meaning was conveyed. Now, I don't want to overstate this method. This is only one in several layers of primary source analysis. And you don't want to overanalyze things. You don't want to think that this will tell us the scientific truth of the document. It's simply a tool, another way, another perspective on a document or primary source. So the first thing we have to do is we have to make sure we understand our terms. This is going to be primarily looking at syntax. Now, syntax is the order or the construction of the sentences. And in English language documents, such as this one, there is a basic grammatical syntax that we expect most sentences to follow. Now, if you've not studied grammar in a long time, you may only know about this syntax informally. Something sounds right to you or something sounds a bit fishy if it doesn't follow the syntax properly. So we're going to do a crash course now in English grammar for the extent that we need it to understand this methodology. English language grammar is quite complex, and there are no absolute rules in how a sentence must be constructed. However, there are general expectations. So we're going to take this very basic sentence. Odysseus threw the spear at Hector. Now, Odysseus threw the spear at Hector has all the basic components that you need to understand this methodology. The first is that a sentence has 4 main parts: the subject, the verb, the indirect object, and the direct object. Now, the subject of the sentence is the person or the thing that is acting out the verb. It doesn't really matter what kind of verb it is, whether it is an active verb like threw or a passive verb like was thrown. It doesn't matter if it's transitive, such as kicked or punched or gave, or if it was intransitive, such as spoke or ran. It doesn't even matter if it is an action verb and something the person is doing, or a relational verb, which I mean generally speaking to be or is, are, that sort of word. All of these verbs, all of these ways of acting or behaving, thinking or speaking, are undertaken by the subject of the sentence, Odysseus. The second half of the sentence is called the predicate, and the predicate has the other 3 parts. Now, the verb is probably the most important, and again, you'll need to identify what type of verb it is later, but for the moment, we just need to know that there is a verb in any clause. And then we have the direct object and the indirect object. Now, these can be accidentally confused, but it really is as simple as these 2 different things. What is being acted upon directly and what is being acted upon indirectly by that verb, by that subject. So if we think about Odysseus threw the spear at Hector, what is he actually throwing? The spear or Hector? Well, he's throwing the spear. So the spear is the direct object. The verb is directly affecting that object. Now the spear is going to come hurtling through the air at Hector. So he is indirectly affected by the throwing of the spear. So he is the indirect object. And it's really as simple as that. Odysseus threw the spear at Hector. Subject, verb, direct object, indirect object. Now, what does this have to do with English language syntax? Well, generally speaking, we expect a sentence to follow this basic pattern: subject, verb, direct object. Now, the indirect object usually appears somewhere in the predicate. It could be before the direct object or after the direct object, but it's usually after the verb and certainly after the subject. The subject usually comes first and the verb is somewhere in the middle. So think about it this way. If I say Odysseus threw the spear at Hector, that sounds right. If I say Odysseus threw at Hector the spear, it sounds a little bit weird. You wouldn't expect me to say it in that order. If I say the spear Odysseus threw at Hector, you understand what that sentence means, but it sounds a bit odd, doesn't it? The spear doesn't usually come first. The direct object doesn't usually come first. And if I say at Hector the spear Odysseus threw, it sounds maybe poetic, but certainly not normal English syntax. Now again, English is a very flexible language. We can order these most ways that we want to, not every way we want to, but in most ways with poetic license. But if we do not go subject, predicate, verb, objects, people will notice, at least subconsciously, and that allows for something called effect. So if I say the spear Odysseus threw at Hector, that is putting the spear at the start of the sentence. It's noticeably there. We pay attention to it. The spear is the important part of that sentence, rather than Odysseus or even poor Hector. So now we'll turn to our primary source and see if we can identify these different parts in our document as well. We begin with our letter and we notice that it is one giant block of text. How are we going to go about identifying all of these different subjects, verbs, objects, and indirect objects? Well, the first thing we need to do is separate it into easily readable clauses. Now, I don't say sentences because of two very important factors. One, a sentence could have several clauses, that is, several subjects and predicates held together by either conjunctions like and, or prepositional phrases, or various other dependent-independent clause modifiers. But the more important reason that we don't want to do this sentence by sentence is that this is a personal letter, and Samuel Revens does not write perfect sentences. He tends to use lots of dashes and semicolons, and so it kind of meanders from thought to thought, and it doesn't follow things in a simple, straightforward way. We have to be a little bit flexible. So we'll start at the beginning here, and we have this date line and location line, and these are just formal parts of a letter. We don't need to worry about those. The same with the salutation of "My dear Chapman." Where we want to begin is here at the beginning of the actual letter. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new line for every single clause. And I'm going to talk you through the first two so you can see what's important and what isn't important and how to indicate those different clauses. So first, let's read the first sentence. On the road to Wellington last week, I got your note of the 20th instant at the post office and intended to be sure to answer it, but managed to miss the steamer, for which I was sorry, because I was anxious to state I have so much requiring my presence that I cannot go away just now, and that therefore you cannot let Charlie come too soon. Now, there's a dash here, and I'm going to consider that the end of the sentence because it's going on for a bit too long, and that seems like a fairly cohesive thought. But as I'm sure you could hear from the way I spoke, there are lots of clauses in this sentence. So how do we separate it out? Well, let's start with the first idea, the first subject-verb pairing. On the road to Wellington last week is a prepositional phrase. It just tells us when and where this happened, so we can kind of ignore it for the moment. I got your note of the 20th instant at the post office and. Now that and is a conjunction, so it's basically sticking two different clauses together. So I'm going to separate that and out and just work with this first clause here. So again, on the road to Wellington, not important for our current analysis. I got your note of the 20th instant at the post office. At the post office, again, a prepositional phrase, where he got it, not important. Of the 20th instant, or the 20th of this month, that tells us a bit about the note, but not important for the basic idea of the sentence. Really, the clause is I got your note. That's really all we need. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use the strike through function on a word to get rid of the bits that I don't necessarily need for this particular part of the analysis. I got your note. That is a single clause. There's a subject, I, a verb, got, and a direct object, your note. And that's all there is to it. Let's do another one just to make sure you understand. Intended to be sure to answer it, but. Again, but is another conjunction, so I'm going to separate that out. And if you look here, there doesn't seem to be a subject. Intended to be sure to answer it starts essentially with the predicate, but there is an implied I from this first part of the sentence. So I'm going to go ahead and put in brackets I. Now, anytime you're adding things to a document, it's really good practice to stick it in square brackets to remind yourself you added that to the document. That was not originally there. So I intended to be sure to answer it. So intended is the verb, I intended, and to be sure to answer it, sounds like another verb, to be. But because it's an infinitive, the to making it so, this is actually a noun phrase, a verb acting as a noun phrase, which is called a participle. So I intended to be sure to answer it. To be sure to answer it is essentially the direct object of this sentence or this clause. Okay, we're doing pretty well. Let's go on to the next one. Managed to miss the steamer, for which I was sorry because I was anxious to state, and he goes on. Managed to miss the steamer, for which I was sorry. Now, for which is a special phrase that indicates that it's going to be followed by a dependent clause. This information, I managed to miss the steamer, he's giving more information about it, for which I was sorry. So we'll take the for which, use that as a divider, and look again at just managed to miss the steamer. And again, there's an implied I there. Managed and to miss the steamer, again, another participle phrase. Okay, let's keep going. We're almost there. I was sorry because I was anxious to state. Oh my goodness, he's doing quite a lot of these layers upon layers of clauses, isn't he? I was sorry because. Because, again, is a dependent clause indicator. So I was sorry. Now, was is a relational verb. It basically says equal to. I am equal to sorry. Because I was anxious to state that I have so much requiring my presence that I cannot go away just now. Okay, so he was anxious to state. So was anxious is actually the verb of this sentence. Was is the relational to anxious, which is his current state, or the direct object, for more or less. So I was anxious to state that I have so much requiring my presence that I cannot go away just now. Anxious to state I have so much requiring my presence I cannot go away just now is the entire predicate of was. That's describing his entire state. When we get to this and, we know we're starting yet another clause. And that therefore kind of indicates that it's a new clause. This is a dependent clause indicator. You cannot let Charlie come too soon. Now this is going to take a moment to actually parse. You is the subject. That's pretty easy. The verb is a little bit more difficult. Cannot is not a verb on its own. We actually need to have the second half of that verb. Cannot drink, cannot sleep, cannot let. So, cannot let is our verb, which leaves Charlie come too soon. Now, Charlie come too soon implies that there is either an object or an indirect object, that is Charlie. But we have to sort of think about what type of verb let is. Is it a transitive or an intransitive verb? Is it something that is acting upon another person? Well, yes, it is letting Charlie. It's permitting Charlie. It's doing something to Charlie. So Charlie is the direct object of this sentence. Now, what is it letting Charlie do? Come too soon. So really the verb cannot let come too soon Charlie is the way that I would basically try to explain it in terms of those three parts. But it's sort of been arranged in a way that sounds better in English, which is cannot let Charlie come too soon. So there you go. That first sentence has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different clauses in it, which is a lot for a single sentence, but makes sense that this is a personal letter that's going to meander around several topics. So now what we need to do is to go through the rest of the document and find all the other clauses before we move on to the next stage. Okay, so now we've gone through this entire document and we've separated it into individual clauses as best we can. I'm sure I've made a couple mistakes, created a clause when really it was such an independent, or rather a dependent clause, that perhaps it didn't really need to be separated out, and I may have missed some. But the general point is that you try to do as many as you can, as best as you can, in order to get a sense of the grammar, of the syntax being used by the author to convey their message, and what hidden or subconscious ideas you might find from that information. So the next thing we need to do is we need to transfer this into a spreadsheet document so we can separate out all those different parts: the subject, the verb, the direct object, and the indirect object. So here I've opened up an Excel document with 4 basic columns: subject, verb, direct object, and indirect object. And what I'm going to do now is go through the entire document, and I'm going to input these into my spreadsheet. Now I could add an additional column here where I put in the original, and that can be really helpful if I want to go back and double check the context at any one point. But it's not crucial to what we're doing. So I am going to copy and paste it into this section, but I'm not going to worry about it too much in terms of looking at it constantly. So if I go over to my original and I highlight everything, because I've made them all individual lines, I can just copy, Control C, go over to A and paste, Control V, and each one will appear on its own line. And I can see, for example, here, as I fill in each section, it's going to cover up the original, and that's fine. That's all I need it to do. I will go through and delete all of these conjunctions and prepositional phrase markers, just so they're not cluttering up my document, but I can always go back and look at my original text when I need to. So, I got your note. So the subject is I, the verb is got, the direct object is note, and I think for this particular case, I'm going to put in that little bit of extra information, your note. And there is no indirect object. There's no person or thing that's an intermediary force in this sentence. So I'm just going to leave that one blank. Going to go ahead and delete the and. I intended to be sure to answer it. Now again, this I is added. It's something that I included. So I am going to go like this, I, and I'm just going to go up to the top of my document here so I can see it without having to constantly reopen this. Intended to be sure to answer it. So the verb is intended, and the direct object is to be sure to answer it. To be sure to answer it. Now, this isn't a direct object in the normal transitive verb sense, but it is the object of the intention. It is what the intention is. So we're going to put it there. That's grammatically where it fits in our analysis. Again, removing the but. I managed to miss the steamer. I is the subject. Again, it's implied, so we put it into the square brackets. Managed, and the direct object is another infinitive phrase, to miss the steamer. For which is an indicator of a clause. We'll get rid of that. I was sorry. Now this time the I is actually there, so I was sorry. And I'm going to go through the rest of these now and translate them all into individual sections. Again, this is me trying to fit my methodology to the text I have available. But when he says that when I said to Featherston and Fitzherbert, I got for reply it was reverse, basically what he's saying is that from Featherston and Fitzherbert is where this reply came from. And so I put that in the indirect object in the same way you would give a gift to somebody, you were receiving a reply from somebody. Again, it's not a perfect system. It's not necessarily accurate to call it the indirect object, but for the purpose of this particular analysis, that's where we're going to put it. Okay, so that didn't take too long. I went through and I put everything into subject, verb, and direct and indirect object as best I could. There's a lot of blank lines here and I want to get rid of those, so I'm going to go through and get rid of those really quickly. Now that we've separated our text into 4 columns, subject, verb, direct, and indirect object, we need to decide what kind of analysis we want to do. Now, if I put a bit more detail here in adverbs and adjectives, we could undertake something called sentiment analysis. And in fact, we're going to do that with this document in another video. But for today, I've only put in the very basic information because I really want to look at the grammar of the sentences. How was it constructed? So I'm going to look at a couple of different things in terms of grammar and syntax. The first is the type of verb. And I'm going to be looking at whether the verb is active or passive. What I mean by that is basically, is the subject actually having an action done to them? Are they the passive recipient of an action? Or are they actively doing it to somebody or something else? And then I want to have a look at whether or not an object or a direct object is a person or a thing. And the reason for this will become clear in a moment, but let's just look through a couple of these. So first, I'm going to create a new column here, and I'm going to call it Verb Voice. And the voice is going to be either active or passive. And then I'm going to create another column, which is direct object type, or dot. And that's basically going to say, is it an object or a person? And I'm going to do the same with the indirect object type, I dot. So if I make this just a little bit smaller so we can see it all on one page, I'm going to go through and look at every single sentence and try to find out these 3 things. So first, I got your note. Got is an active verb. I is actually doing that thing. He's gotting it. Now, please excuse the terrible way I've just said that, but you can see that it's not something that's happening to him, it's something that he is doing. Now, I realize to receive a letter is sort of a passive activity, but you're not trying to look at the semantics of the verb, you're looking at the syntax, and the voice of that verb is the active got. So the verb voice is active. The direct object is a note, it's a physical object. So we're going to say item, and there is no indirect object, so we're going to skip that. Now we look at the second sentence. I intended to be sure to answer it. Okay, so intended, again, that's an active verb. And is the second part, the direct object, a item or a person? Well, to be sure to answer it is an infinitive, a participle. So how do we turn that into an item or a person? Well, it's an abstract concept. So we're going to put that exactly like that, an abstract. And we can do this for any type of thought or concept, something that's not a physical item. I managed to miss the steamer. again, that's very active. He's actively managing it. And it is the idea of missing the steamer. So we'll go with abstract once again. Now we have I was sorry. Now, I was sorry is active. It's something that the I is actively doing. But how do we deal with sorry? Well, it is abstract again, but I think probably the most useful thing that we want to put here is relational. And relational really refers to the verb, but it gives us a sense that this is a definition. I am a sorry thing. I am a thing that is sorry. So it gives us a sense that it's not acting upon an abstract notion, but is actually just providing a definition or an equivalency. I was anxious to state. Okay, again, this is active. And it is relational. It's saying that I am a thing that is anxious to state something. So we're going to type in relational once again. And none of these have indirect objects, so we don't need to do anything here just yet. So let's go through a couple more of these and see if anything weird or unexpected pops up. Okay, so we found one right away. Charlie is a person. Now, letting Charlie come too soon is necessarily an abstract idea. It's the concept of permission being given for a thing. But Charlie is a person in that statement of permission. And I really think that it's important to indicate that that is concerning a person being acted upon. When we get to the 9th clause, we find a passive verb. And the way we know that is that the land is not actively doing something, it's having something done to it. Land can be purchased. Now, this is very, very important because it doesn't give us a sense of who the active party is. It's not that I am purchasing the land or he is purchasing the land or can purchase the land. It's just that the land can be purchased. So in terms of direct object, what type is it? We can assume that it's a person, but in the case of passive verbs, what we want to indicate is whether it is stated or unstated. And in this case, it is unstated. We do not know who is undertaking the action. Now, this one says we have some new blood. And that is a metaphorical statement of people, new blood, new people, people who are coming in with a different point of view, a different energy, but it's still a person. It's not a inanimate object, but in fact an animate one, a person or people. So that's how we're going to label it. Okay, now we've got our first indirect object, for answer. Now, again, this is not an indirect object, perhaps in the truest grammatical sense, but it gives us a sense of the other players within this sentence. So it is active, I got, and there is an abstract direct object, doubts. So where do we put in for answer? Well, again, it's not a person, it's not an item, it is an abstract concept, the idea of the reply or the answer. So that's what we're going to put in, abstract. Okay, so now we've got a couple of sentences that look like they're active tense, but in meaning, semantically, they are passive. So ministers are to have houses rent-free. Well, ministers are to have is an active, grammatically speaking, sentence. They are in the future going to have something, houses rent-free. But you can interpret it as somebody's going to give them a free house. But strictly speaking, it is talking about them doing something. They are having something. So we'll leave that one active. And they are getting an item of houses rent-free. The second sentence is a little bit different, even though it looks very similar. They are being purchased. Now, you can tell this is a passive sentence by what I've put here in the direct object incorrectly, and it's actually part of the verb, are being purchased. That is a passive version of purchasing, or they purchase, they are being purchased. So this is a passive tense, and again, there is no sense of who is purchasing them. So we are going to say unstated. Now you can see there that I'm actually changing some of these as I go along. As I get a sense more and more for the way that Samuel Revens writes, I'm allowed to change my mind. Something I thought was a direct object now appears to me to be an adverb or something modifying the verb. And that's okay. You don't have to stick with your first impression. Again, it's important not to confuse past or past perfect with the passive voice. So the fact that Roebuck has recovered does not mean that something is causing him to recover. It just means that it happened at some time in the past and is now completed, the perfect tense. Okay, so now we've got quite a lot of information encoded about our document. And if we look at it, it's pretty clear the style in which Samuel Revens is writing. He almost always writes in the active tense. It's not something that he does very often to put things in the passive tense. However, when he does put things in the passive tense, he tends to leave them unstated. So if he says something has been purchased or something is taken, it's very rare that he'll actually say who is doing that. This gives a sense that he is referring to things rhetorically, abstract, or most importantly, in the case of this letter, something that is going to be understood by the other party implicitly. He doesn't always have to spell everything out to Henry Chapman because Chapman will understand who is doing the things he is referring to. The other thing that's really interesting about this is almost all of the document is referring to abstract ideas rather than people or objects. He does have people and objects throughout this document, but by far and away, most of his sentences relate to ideas, relational definitions, abstract concepts. It's very much a thinking letter expressing his thoughts rather than giving statements of narrative fact, this happened or that happened. In fact, most of the times he gives concrete transitive verbs, it relates to the letter writing process itself, that he had intended to write the letter, or he received your note, or his carte de visite was taken. These are about the actual giving and sending of letters as opposed to the content of the letter. Now, in terms of indirect objects, I only really have a few, and these are usually people. So this gives a sense that when he's talking about abstract ideas or he's talking about items, the people involved are being given as secondary information as opposed to the forefront of the sentence. This brings me to the last part of this methodology, which is the subject of the individual clauses. Now, I could have just done the basic person, place, thing, abstract idea that I did for the direct object and the indirect object, and it would have provided some interesting information, whether or not animate or inanimate objects seem to be the beginning of the sentence. But that's not necessarily the most important thing to draw from this information. Instead, we want to think about something called foregrounding. Now, foregrounding is when you arrange the sentence in a certain way that certain information comes either out of the normal order of things or is placed right at the front of the sentence in accordance with the normal order of things, but grammatically has been shifted around. So what do I mean by that? Well, Basically, you have two ways of putting something at the front of the sentence. You can either simply move it around, but keep it in its syntax position. So have that spear that Odysseus was throwing at the front of the sentence, even though it's still considered a direct object. The spear Odysseus threw at Hector. It makes sense, it sounds okay, and it's clear that the spear is the most important part, so you look directly at it. The other way you can do it is by changing the verb tense. So instead of I gave a letter to somebody, you can say the letter was given by me. It is changing the grammar of the sentence so the letter comes first. And you notice that because it's the beginning of the sentence in English, it is considered the foregrounded or most important noticeable part. So if you think about this in terms of things like war correspondence, if you say that this soldier killed that civilian, the soldier is foregrounded. They're the active party, and that may or may not mean something because that's the normal way an English language sentence is constructed. Subject, active verb, object. But if you say a civilian was killed by a soldier, you're foregrounding the civilian. The civilian is the most important part or the subject of the sentence. And this gives us an indication of how Revens, or how your textual writer in general, views the various things he's talking about. Now, this may be subconscious, how the person thinks about things, little subconscious tricks to make them not apportion blame to themselves or other people, or to give praise to somebody who they might not otherwise be able to grammatically allow for. But quite often it is simply a rhetorical trick. So you will use different words and different orders to make sure your message is clear by the way you've ordered the sentence. So let's have a look at some of our subjects then. If we look at our various subjects, we can see that by far and away, the most common one is I. Now, part of that is because it's a single sentence that I've separated and put in implied I's. But if we just look at it overall, I does seem to be the most prevalent. And if you really want to understand how often that's the case, you can actually have Excel count it for you. So we're going to put in a simple formula here, equals count if, and then we select the range, so this entire thing, and then we put in a comma, and then we put in I. And if we do this, we see that out of these 63 different subjects, 25 of them, or almost half, are I. If we include the I's that I have put into brackets, we get another 5. So almost half of these clauses have Revens himself as the subject. And that, again, makes perfect sense. It's a personal letter trying to express his thoughts as well as his actions to his friends. But what about the other half of those clauses? What are they primarily foregrounding? So let's have a look. You, we, land, confidence, new blood, circumstance, he, last Mel, the Australians. There doesn't seem an immediate sense of what these are, but let's think about this a bit more abstractly, a bit more at a lower resolution or a fuzzier resolution. These are all people. Land is an object, more people, confidence. Now, confidence is an abstract notion, but it's something held by people. So again, talking about people in a very general sense. We, new blood, circumstance, that's an abstract concept that I will say is not so much about people. He, the Australians, our people, we, ministers, they, we, Roebuck, you. There are a lot in here that are actually referring to people. And that's really interesting to me. He's not really skirting around the idea of agency here. He is saying who is doing these things. Now, of course, some of these are more abstract or general than others, But again, people seem to be the active things in these sentences as opposed to the passive recipients of them. And in fact, if we look at some of these things like land or the last mail or the affair, many of them happen to be passive. And the direct object of those sentences, the true active party, is a person as well. So he's not really disembodying people in the way he's talking about things. So most of these things are I, most of the other ones are people. So that tells us something about the document as a whole. What it really tells me, though, what I think is most interesting, is when does he deviate from the norm? When does he do something different than he does in the rest of his document? Well, let's look at those concrete items. We have land, we have circumstance, the last mail, the affair, the Native Land Purchase Act, the machinery, what is called quieting laws and the measure, and that's it. Those are the only concrete active voices in this letter. And they're all related to this idea of the land ownership question in New Zealand. In fact, the only one that really isn't about that is last mail. And in a way, that really is a person, not an object. It is talking about the latest letters or the latest press releases about things that are going on, something a person has written and put out there. So we're going to take that one out. So the affair is about giving land to ministers, giving government subsidized housing, so to speak, to officials of the government. And the measure, the Native Land Purchase Act, the machinery, all of this is referring to a piece of legislation. So what we get here is that there are two main bodies, two active groups. One of them is Revens and his circle of friends, his radical friends, his political friends. And the other are the political circumstances, the legislation, or the civil ordinances that they are most concerned about. So they're all basically on a common theme. And that is something that I think is really interesting. This entire letter is about political people or political agents, things like legislation that, even though they're not people, they act on the world. So what can we say about this letter looking just at the grammar of the sentences? First and foremost, Revens is writing a personal letter, and grammar and syntax are not necessarily at the forefront of his mind. This really comes across as a conversational, friendly letter that isn't too much concerned with rhetoric or rhetorical tricks and the trade. Even though he is a newspaper man and he is very eloquent in his writing, he's speaking to a friend, not someone he's necessarily trying to deceive or trick into believing a particular ideology. He also tends to use I and talks about abstract direct objects. Most of the letter is concerned with his inner life, his thinking, how he is looking at the world, and what his beliefs and hopes and concerns are. This is not a letter about narrating facts of things that have happened or activities that have occurred. This is about concepts, abstract ideas. His letter is also filled with the active voice of people as opposed to objects or things. This is not some grand impersonal force that is acting upon New Zealand or the British Empire or Revens' life itself. These are individuals that he is identifying as having undertaken certain activities. He only uses the passive tense in a few locations, and when he does so, what he is generally speaking doing is implying a person or a group of people who are undertaking a particular action. So why is he implying rather than stating? Well, you have to remember this is a personal letter. So in that context, he probably thinks that Chapman knows who he's referring to. So the fact that it's passive and unstated who the actor is important. You can't just write it off as, well, Chapman knows who he's talking about. The fact that he expects Chapman to know who he's talking about in these few particular cases is really insightful. The final thing I want to really bring about looking at the grammar of these sentences is the fact that if somebody is trying to convey a narrative of things that have happened, they will often foreground the people they find most important. In Revance's letter, most of the things that he foregrounds are simply grammatically supposed to come first in that sentence. He doesn't seem to be trying to paint even Sir George Grey, who he seems to really rather dislike, by putting him at the front of the sentence with lots of negative adjectives. He is simply stating the facts as best he can. So, if you find a document that is almost entirely in the active tense, and is almost entirely following that basic grammatical model of subject and predicate as we have here, what you can generally speaking infer is that they are not trying to employ rhetorical ideas either to convince themselves subconsciously or their reader of a particular different interpretation of the evidence. Now, that might be that the evidence already favors their interpretation when laid out in that manner, or it could be that they're just being earnest in the way that they're writing. That's something you have to decide from the text and the context. So I hope you found this video helpful in determining not only how to separate your document into these different grammatical functions, but some of the ideas you can get about foregrounding, active and passive voice, and also what is being or who is being acted upon throughout the course of a document. If you go through your document and you find very different types of trends, things that are, generally speaking, people are always the direct object and things are always in the passive tense, that gives a very different impression. Bad things or good things are happening to people, but there's no active agent. This is really a different way of giving information. But as for Samuel Revans, he seems to be pretty straightforward with what he wants to say here. So in our next video, we'll use this as a stepping stone, a pre-organized set of data to perform something a little bit more in depth, sentiment analysis. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please consider hitting the like button below or subscribing to the channel. That'll let me know this is the type of video you want to see more of. And if you have any questions, comments, or just a suggestion for an upcoming video, please leave a comment below.